Today we're going to talk about diffusion, osmosis, and the cell membrane. So why in this unit about cells are we taking time to stop and talk about diffusion and osmosis? If this is our cell, certain molecules like H2O have to get into the cell, and other molecules like CO2 have to move out of the cell. If the cell is really large, it's going to take too much time for the water to get in and the carbon dioxide to get out. So one way of solving this problem is to simply have the cells smaller. And what we have is 4 cells that have the same volume as this one large cell. And what that does is allow the water to be able to get in faster and the CO2 to get out faster. So then why aren't cells just really, really small? Well, as you know, inside of these cells, there's things like organelles and genetic information, and there needs to be enough room for these organelles. So there's really the perfect size for a cell. A size large enough that all of the parts can fit inside, but small enough that water can get in quickly and carbon dioxide can get out quickly. Let's talk about the concentration gradient. Concentration gradient is simply referring to a difference in concentration. The more concentrated a solution is, it's called hypertonic. When it's less concentrated, it's called hypotonic. And if the concentration is the same both inside the cell and outside the cell, then it's called an isotonic state. In this image, what we're looking at is the concentration gradient. So we're looking at the concentration of carbon dioxide in relation to blood. How much carbon dioxide is in the blood? Well, here, this is the top of the concentration gradient. The concentration of carbon dioxide is quite high. At the bottom of the concentration gradient, carbon dioxide is quite low. So we call this moving down the concentration gradient. So carbon dioxide is moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. In the first image, first of all, what we're looking at, on the top we're looking at animal cells. On the bottom we're looking at plant cells. And in this first image, we're looking at a hypotonic solution. So basically what that means is there's more water inside of the cell than on the outside of the cell. And for an animal cell, this is very bad because if you remember, animal cells just simply have a membrane on the outside. So if there's too much water on the inside, it creates too much pressure. We call that osmotic pressure. If there's too much pressure, then the cell will lyse or burst. In a plant cell, it's slightly different because on the outside of the cell membrane, we have this cell wall that's providing structure and rigidity. So, too much water inside of the cell, while it's still not great, it can actually just provide more structure for the cell so that the plant stands upright. Now, of course, if you overwater a plant, you're going to kill it because you are bursting its cells. It just requires more water than an animal cell because of the cell wall. In the middle of this image, we're seeing an isotonic solution, which means that the water on the inside of the cell is the same amount as the water on the outside of the cell. And this is perfect both for plant and animal cells. This last image is a hypertonic state. So this is when we start to see cells shrivel up because there's more water on the outside than on the inside. So thinking about these 3 images, in what state might your cells be when you're feeling thirsty? Think about homeostasis. When you get thirsty, that's your body telling you that you don't have enough fluid. Where does your body want that fluid to be? Well, it wants it to be inside of a cell. So when you're thirsty, you are actually feeling hypertonic. So the next time you ask Miss Corkery to go get a drink of water, say, Miss Corkery, I'm feeling hypertonic. And I'll know that you need some more water because there is more water on the outside of your cells than on the inside, and your cells are starting to shrivel. So your body's telling you, hey, Get some water so you're not thirsty. All right, let's talk about diffusion and passive transport. Diffusion is a process by which molecules are moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Molecules are constantly creating kinetic energy because they're intermingling with each other. They're constantly bouncing off of each other, and that creates kinetic energy. And that is how cells move naturally without any added energy. When there's no added energy, it's called passive transport. No additional energy. So if we look at these images, what we're seeing here is two solutions, one that has a higher concentration than the other. Over time, the molecules in red are going to move through the semipermeable membrane from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration as they move down the concentration gradient. This is exactly what happens when sugar is dissolved in water. So this lump of sugar is added to a beaker of water, and initially there's a very high concentration of sugar. But over time, that sugar is going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and the sugar becomes dissolved. So all molecules are in constant motion and continually spreading apart from each other, moving down the concentration gradient. Molecules are moving from an area of high to low concentration through the process of diffusion. When they're simply moving down the concentration gradient because they've been bouncing off of each other, that's called passive transport. Another example is a tea bag. So when you add a bag of tea to water, the bag is acting as a semipermeable membrane. Water is going to move into the bag via osmosis, and then the tea flavor is going to start to move out of the bag through the process of diffusion. So intercellular circulation happens in the same process. The movement of materials within a cell can happen via diffusion depending on the materials, depending on the molecules. So as those molecules are moving through the cell, they're bouncing off of each other, creating this kinetic energy, which is a form of passive transport, and that is creating diffusion within the cell. So let's stop and take a look at diffusion in action.
Molecules dissolved in a solution are in constant random motion due to their kinetic energy. One result of this motion is that dissolved molecules become evenly distributed throughout the solution. This tendency of molecules to spread out is an example of diffusion. But how do these molecules come to be evenly distributed? Let's start with a beaker of plain water. What will happen if we now add a lump of sugar to the water? A lump of sugar is composed of many individual sugar molecules, and even as a solid lump, the individual sugar molecules are in motion. When the lump is dropped into the water, it begins to dissolve. Individual sugar molecules move randomly and constantly from the area where they are common to the area where they are scarce. This type of motion, when molecules move from areas of their higher concentration to areas of their lower concentration, is called diffusion. Diffusion continues until all the sugar molecules become evenly dispersed throughout the beaker. The rate of diffusion is affected by temperature, size of molecules, and the steepness of the concentration gradient. Although not specifically shown in this animation, this is one of the processes whereby materials are exchanged between a cell and its environment.
So your second quick question, can you explain the relationship between the concentration gradient, kinetic energy, passive transportation, and diffusion? Take a moment, pause this video, look back through your notes, see if you can answer this question. Let's talk about the relationship. So the difference in concentration solution, meaning that when there is a higher concentration in one area and a lower concentration in another area, molecules via kinetic energy are going to move down the concentration gradient. And this is known as passive transport. Passive transport is the movement of molecules with only kinetic energy, no other added energy. And this kinetic energy is created through the natural movement of molecules when they are bouncing off of each other. So Diffusion is when these molecules are moving down the concentration gradient. They're moving from an area of high to low concentration via kinetic energy. So let's talk about active transport. We've been talking about passive transport, where it's just an energy that is naturally created through molecules interacting with each other. Let's talk about active transport, when more energy is added. So active transport is the movement of particles with the use of energy other than kinetic energy. Sometimes active transport can move molecules from an area of low to high concentration, meaning that the molecules are actually moving against the concentration gradient. One of the most common places where this happens is actually in your brain. If you want to find out all about that, take AP Bio. So what is the difference between diffusion and active transport? Well, diffusion occurs via passive transport, no added energy. Molecules are simply moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration because they're spreading out as they bounce off of each other. Active transport requires an additional source of energy, something other than kinetic energy, and molecules can actually move up the concentration gradient. They can move from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. Osmosis is the diffusion of water. So we talked about the tea bag earlier and water moving into the tea bag via osmosis. So osmosis specifically pertains to water. Water moves via kinetic energy from a less salty or sugary solution to a more salty or sugary solution to dilute out the salt or sugars. So it's